In 1958, Venezuela's dictator, Marcos Pérez Jiménez, was ousted by a popular uprising and fled the country. Jiménez was but one of many dictatorial strongmen who ran Venezuela up until this point, and he was particularly cruel. Author and journalist Bart Jones put it succinctly in his book Hugo, saying, "Bribes, kickbacks, and assassinations were common under Jiménez's rule." Despite his barbarity, the United States viewed him favorably and even rewarded him with the Legion of Merit, the highest civilian award. This infuriated many Venezuelans who suffered under him, but the Americans didn't pay them any mind because Jiménez was vehemently anti-communist, meaning he served as a loyal and important ally during the Cold War. And even more importantly, Jiménez was incredibly accommodating to U.S. companies. He had renewed the Treaty of Reciprocal Trade with the United States, which permitted a wide range of cheap imported manufactured products to overrun national markets. As a result, non-construction related industries suffered. His simultaneous encouragement of foreign capital inflows, which tripled during his government, also threatened local initiative, noted Professor Terry Lynn Carl in her paper Petroleum and Political Pacts. And of course, there was the whole oil thing. Jiménez allowed for U.S. companies to continue to exploit Venezuela's oil, even dramatically ramping up oil production and offering new concessions. By 1954, the U.S. oil behemoth Standard Oil was benefiting from tax cuts that granted the company an additional $300 million in profits. Uruguayan journalist Eduardo Galeano paints us a vivid image so we can get an idea of how Jiménez ran Venezuela. When dictator Marcos Pérez Jiménez was overthrown in 1958, Venezuela was one huge oil well, surrounded by jails and torture chambers and importing everything from the United States. Cars, refrigerators, condensed milk, eggs, lettuce, laws, and decrees. After Jiménez's rule came to an end, the elites of the country signed something called the Punto Fijo Pact in October of 1958. This was basically a power-sharing agreement between the main political parties in Venezuela, with an explicit stipulation that the Communist Party was to be excluded. It was presented as a way to secure democracy and prevent the rise of another dictator, but what ended up happening was the two main political parties, AD and COPAI, ran the country corruptly for the next 40 years while excluding genuinely viable political opponents like the aforementioned leftists. To understand just how corrupt the government was during this period, one has to look no further than Alan MacLeod's Bad News from Venezuela. Empirical data suggests that virtually every post in liberal institutions before 1998, the beginning of the Hugo Chavez era, was attained due to party loyalty rather than merit. A 1992 report by the World Bank concluded that the judicial system was in crisis due to excessive politicization and bureaucratic incompetence. A UN survey stated that the Venezuelan judiciary was one of the least credible in the world. The appointment of judges was done officially through a quota system, with AD and COPAI appointing officials from their own parties to the judiciary. This led to a situation where clientelism, incompetence, and fraud reigned. Elections themselves were rigged in favor of AD and COPAI. In 1993, it was found that many dead people had voted for these parties. This is a particularly ironic piece of information given how often our Western media outlets harp on about the supposed rigged elections in Venezuela post-Chavez. In reality, Venezuelans at large had more faith in their institutions once Chavez took over in 1999. Empirical evidence gathered from Latinobarometro, a strongly anti-Chavista polling organization, shows that Venezuelans themselves believed the country's democracy and its institutions were extremely flawed in the 1990s, but improved to become the best democracy in Latin America by Chavez's death in 2013. In 1996, fewer than 3% had a lot of confidence in political parties, with nearly 2/3 professing no confidence whatever in them. By 2013, 16% now had a lot of faith, with less than 1/3 having none, among the best figures in Latin America. Trust in the public administration as a whole grew by over 300% between 1996 and 2013 to become the highest in Latin America, double that of the second highest country. In 1997, 11% of Venezuelans believed elections were clean, with 83% believing them to be fraudulent. By 2006, despite the media claiming constantly that they were rigged, 56% believed them clean, with only 30% agreeing with the media. By the late 80s, the country was drowning in debt, feeling the burden of economic liberalism, and in 1989, President Carlos Andrés Pérez, who ran as an anti-neoliberal to appease the masses who understood neoliberalism to be the cause of their struggles, immediately switched up and imposed a brutal austerity package from the IMF. Prices were liberalized, state-owned companies were privatized, the price of gas skyrocketed, bus fares went up precipitously, and the masses felt it. This resulted in the Caracazo, a massive rebellion against neoliberalism. The government responded to this by sending in the army and slaughtering thousands of people. This was the environment on the eve of Hugo Chávez's rise to power. In the West, we're often fed this narrative that Venezuela was once a rich, stable, and prosperous nation up until the evil communist dictator Hugo Chavez murdered everyone on earth and assumed the throne, but this couldn't be further from the truth. Instability was present in Venezuela since Columbus laid foot on the land in 1498. In the early 1900s, dictator Juan Vicente Gómez was plopping people onto meat hooks by their necks and nuts, all while enjoying U.S. support. And we've already covered Marcos Pérez Jiménez and the Punto Fijo era. To blame all of Venezuela's woes on Hugo Chávez and socialism is silly. In fact, Hugo Chávez oversaw some of the greatest achievements in Venezuelan history. MacLeod recounts them in Bad News from Venezuela. In the 20 years prior to Hugo Chávez, Venezuela's Human Development Index rose by just 0.045. But in the first 10 years after Chávez came to power, it increased by 0.084, nearly double the development in half the time, pushing the country from medium to high human development. By 2005, Venezuela was declared illiteracy-free by the United Nations, and major gains were made in living standards compared to the preceding neoliberal era when poverty stood at 49.4% and extreme poverty at 17.9% in 1999. By 2012, overall poverty had been cut roughly in half to 25.4%, while extreme poverty fell by 3/4 to 7.1%. In 2013, the UN Food and Agriculture Organization commended Venezuela for reducing malnourishment, noting that during the neoliberal period, 2.8 million Venezuelans were undernourished, whereas by 2010 under Chávez, the number of undernourished Venezuelans was, quote, not statistically significant, with daily calorie availability rising from under 1,800 per person in 1999 to over 3,000 by 2013. The economy also outperformed that of the two previous neoliberal presidents, Caldera and Perez. According to the UN, unemployment fell from 15% in 1999 to just over 8%. Inflation was curbed such that the highest annual rate under Chávez was roughly equal to the lowest annual rate under his neoliberal predecessors, and inequality declined sharply. The Gini index, a measure of inequality, fell from 0.498 in 1999 to 0.405 in 2012, making Venezuela the second most equal country in Latin America, while the poorest 40% saw their share of national income rise from 14.3% in 1999 to 19.8% in 2013, an increase of over 1/3, all without financially harming the middle class. As MacLeod summarizes, there was no great revolution in income inequality, rather a slow but significant transfer of income from the richest 10% to the lowest 70% of society. Overall, the data shows considerable social and economic progress under Chávez, with inequality, poverty, illiteracy, malnourishment, and inflation falling greatly, while GNP per capita and human development increased substantially. Chávez died in 2013, and his hand-picked successor, Nicolas Maduro, soon after entered elections against Enrique Capriles, the son of two of the richest families in Venezuela who received, quote, 3 times as much coverage as Maduro on the 4 private terrestrial channels, whom devoted so much attention to Capriles that every day of the campaign period, they broke the law that imposes a legal maximum limit. Venezuela's electoral process has been heralded as being one of the best in the world. It uses a highly monitored, multi-step system in which voters must present their ID and have their fingerprint scanned before voting electronically. After casting their vote, voters receive a paper receipt that they place into a ballot box, allowing the electronic results to be verified against the paper trail. While votes are counted automatically, a random 50+% of ballot boxes are audited through a full manual count, and the paper and electronic results must match exactly. The entire process is overseen by representatives from all political parties and international observers, making Venezuela's elections among the most heavily monitored in the world, with the current secure system introduced in 1998 and later significantly strengthened. Even the Carter Center, which is largely funded by corporations and headed in part by Jennifer McCoy, an open anti-Chavista, found no problems with the system. When Maduro beat his opponent, Capriles, in 2013, Capriles refused to accept the results and cried fraud. This is something that Venezuelan opposition does frequently because they know that by repeating this lie, the Western media will surely jump in and present their grievances as fact. Nevertheless, the CNE, the Venezuelan Elections Council, agreed to a full 100% audit of the vote, largely due to the fact that Capriles ordered his supporters to protest the election and things were getting bloody on the streets. The audit confirmed that the original results were accurate, but Capriles still wasn't happy and demanded more. As McLeod put it, Capriles was moving the goalposts in order to allow his allies in the international media to use their cultural power to frame the event as fraud. I say all of this to say, in the West, we don't easily get the full picture in regards to Venezuela because our mainstream media won't permit it. Venezuela is not nice for American profits, so the US media is not nice to it. Are there genuine and serious internal issues in Venezuela? Of course. What country is exempt from that? Can many of those issues be attributed to the way Venezuela has been treated by the world's superpowers, to the sanctions and economic warfare resulting in increased centralization? Yes, and I'm not even trying to come off as though Maduro is my favorite world leader. Many of you who are familiar with my channel have probably seen me criticize his policies in the past. There are arguments against his economic policies that come from his left that I find worthwhile, and whether or not electoral integrity has declined in recent years is a matter of debate. But this is entirely irrelevant to the current issue. There are plenty of things my own elected officials do that I don't fuck with. I don't like Mark Carney. I didn't like Justin Trudeau. But I don't think Trump should kidnap either of them and run Canada as he says he wants to do with Venezuela. The US is morally superior to absolutely no one. But I digress. I say this to say, instead of delving into the nuances of Venezuela and how external pressure plays a role in increasing centralization, our media system would rather just paint Venezuela as an evil enemy country that is mean to our companies and apparently sending drugs into the US. Which brings us to the current day. We already know Trump would not have kidnapped Maduro over a genuine care for democracy and an opposition to human rights abuses. If that were the case, Trump would kidnap the Saudi Crown Prince Mohammed bin Salman or Israel's Benjamin Netanyahu instead of allying with them. Maduro isn't even accused of anything remotely comparable to genocide, which Netanyahu has committed. And when it comes to the drugs narrative, that's easily refutable. If Trump cared about arresting drug traffickers, he wouldn't have just pardoned Juan Orlando Hernandez, the US-backed right-wing Honduran ex-president who paved a cocaine superhighway to the United States, as US prosecutors put it. So why Maduro? Why Venezuela? Real quick, this is not an ad, so please don't skip it. I just wanted to let you know that I started a podcast with my friend and co-host Chris Kunzler. He is British, which is totally fine because we love everybody. But there's new episodes every week. We talk about history, we talk about current events. We've had some really cool guests on so far and plan to have more in the future. We just put out an episode where we're talking about Venezuela, so if you care about the topic and want to see more, head on over there. The podcast is called No Politic Here, and I hope you like it. Thanks. As the year 2000 was coming to an end, the Iraqi head of state and ex-US ally, Saddam Hussein, decided to commit the ultimate heresy. This was around the time the euro was being created, and Saddam was interested in the nascent currency, so the Iraqi government announced that it would no longer accept dollars for oil sold under the UN's Oil for Food program and switched Iraq's oil export currency to the euro. At the time, the euro was a new and relatively weak currency, so people scoffed at Saddam's decision, calling it irrational. But Hussein insisted that the US dollar was the currency of the enemy, and he remained set on the euro. As time passed, and the euro had appreciated in value and the dollar had depreciated, Saddam's move to ditch the dollar proved to be lucrative. This posed a major threat to the US, which feared that other oil exporting countries would see Saddam's success in adopting an alternative currency and follow his lead by abandoning the dollar, ultimately undermining US dollar hegemony. I mean, Gaddafi in Libya was already a thorn in the West side and would soon advocate for a currency other than the dollar to be used in his oil sales. And in 2001, the Latin American nation of Venezuela was speaking of ditching the dollar for the euro as well. I wonder if Iraq, Libya, and Venezuela have something in common when it comes to how the US has treated them. Now, if you are confused as to why the US is set on maintaining the petrodollar, what the petrodollar system even is, and how it affects the world, let me explain. Up until 1971, the US operated on the Bretton Woods system, where US dollars were convertible to gold at a rate of $35 to 1 ounce. Due largely to US military spending in Asia, the US no longer had enough gold to back its dollar and had to switch to a free-floating fiat model. This switch came with some benefits for the Americans, as foreign banks holding US dollars could no longer convert them to gold, so instead they invested in US bonds, creating a dynamic where foreign countries were financing US debt and funding US industries like the military. Now, in order to keep and expand on this dynamic, the US had to ensure a constant source of demand for the new fiat US dollar. So, in 1974, the Americans struck a deal with the House of Saud, stipulating that the Saudis would conduct their oil sales in US dollars in exchange for US military and economic support. Since this meant that the Saudis would have a surplus of US dollars hanging around due to all of their oil sales being conducted in that currency, they also agreed to reinvest those dollars into US bonds and industries such as the military. Soon after, many other oil exporting countries would follow suit. This dynamic is sometimes colloquially referred to as the petrodollar system, and the act of countries obtaining dollars to buy oil and then those same dollars being eventually reinvested in the US because the oil exporting countries can't just let them sit idly for inflation would devalue them, is known as petro-recycling. This places the US in a position of exorbitant privilege, as economist Barry Eichengreen put it, and solidifies US dollar hegemony. This petrodollar recycling fixed the US deficit problem. The world needed oil. To buy oil, the world first needed dollars. To get dollars, they had to ship real goods and services to the US, while the US could cheaply print the money needed to buy those goods, and the money from those oil sales flowed straight back to Washington, financing the very deficits the US had created through its empire. Now, this system has horrific effects on the global south. One side effect is that many countries keep their currencies artificially low to make their exports more appealing, which also helps them earn US dollars easier. The others come in the form of the US dollar dominating the globe, giving the Americans more leverage to sanction and conduct economic warfare against any country that does not fall in line. Speaking of countries that don't fall in line, Venezuela recently started selling their oil to China, the recipient of 80% of Venezuelan exports, using the yuan. Venezuela has been entertaining the use of other currencies as well. In fact, it wasn't too long ago when Venezuela was experimenting with an oil-backed cryptocurrency, but the US was quick to sanction and shut that shit down. So yes, Venezuela was attacked over oil. I mean, Trump literally said as much, but in specific, Venezuela was attacked because it was selling its oil to US adversaries in a currency other than the US dollar. Although I believe this petrodollar stuff to be a big reason why the US attacked Venezuela and kidnapped Maduro, I don't think it's the only one. I'll dedicate this segment to my other speculations. Yes, I do think good old-fashioned oil is a major culprit here. How could I not, with Trump openly saying as much? Still, some skeptics argue oil can't really be a motivating factor because Venezuelan crude is heavy and sour and therefore harder to refine. But that actually misses the point. American oil refineries, especially along the Gulf Coast, are specifically built to process heavier crude. These refineries don't operate most efficiently on light inputs alone. They work best with a blend of lighter and heavier crude. And before the US shale boom dramatically increased production of light, sweet crude like West Texas Intermediate, American refineries were largely designed with heavier crude in mind. That legacy still matters today. A large share of US refining capacity runs most efficiently on heavier crude, which is why most US oil imports are heavier grades. Refiners typically mix cheaper, heavy crude, primarily sourced from Canada and Mexico in recent years, with domestically produced light crude to maximize output and profitability. This is where Venezuelan oil comes in. Venezuelan crude is heavy and well-suited to these refinery configurations. And yeah, Venezuela hasn't been a major supplier to the US in recent years due to sanctions and shit, but its oil remains structurally valuable to US refiners if steady flows can be restored. In addition to this, like we've already mentioned, Venezuela will now potentially be sending oil to the US and not to US adversaries. Sometimes it's not just about the natural resource, but it's how that natural resource is being handled and who gets to benefit from it. The Monroe Doctrine has been recently invoked by Trump, who mentioned it to justify his recent imperial actions. For those who may be unfamiliar, the Monroe Doctrine is a 200-year-old colonial doctrine that claimed all of Latin America as essentially the US's backyard and told other European imperial powers to fuck off. This was later supplemented with Theodore Roosevelt's Roosevelt Corollary, which proclaimed that the US would, in order to further its interests, intervene in Latin American affairs however they want, whenever they want, whether that be through soft power or military force. Fast forward to the modern day, and Trump is announcing the so-called Monroe Doctrine. Well, if the Monroe Doctrine declared Latin America to be in the US's sphere of influence and told the Europeans to kick rocks, the Monroe Doctrine does the same, but instead of ridding the Western Hemisphere of other European powers, it seeks to diminish the influence of China and other current-day U.S. adversaries in the hemisphere. This is not speculation, by the way. Stephen Miller literally said as much in his interview with CNN's Jake Tapper.
The United States is using its military to secure our interests unapologetically in our hemisphere. We're a superpower, and under President Trump, we are going to conduct ourselves as a superpower. It is absurd that we would allow a nation in our own backyard to become the supplier of resources to our adversaries, but not to us.
See, it's about the new Cold War with China. Latin America has oil, gold, rare earth minerals, and more. The US's goal is to kick the Chinese out of the Western Hemisphere and take those Latin American resources for themselves. There's also the Cuba issue. For decades, the US has been suffocating the small island nation of Cuba for their crime of deposing the US-backed butcher Fulgencio Batista in 1959 and telling the Yankees that Cuba would no longer be their slave. Fast forward to today, and Trump has selected as his Secretary of State a man named Marco Rubio, a Miami-born Cuban descendant. Like many Miami Cubans, Rubio grew up hearing how horrific Fidel Castro was and how terribly communism ruined Cuba. In his memoir, An American Son, he even recounts that as a child he dreamed of leading a group of Cuban exiles to overthrow Castro. What a fucking dork. All of this gets really funny when you realize his parents fled Cuba in 1956, meaning they were running from the US-backed Batista, not Fidel and co., who didn't take over until 1959. Anyway, Rubio has a hard-on for Cuba and communism, and his brain seems to be stuck in the Cold War era to the point where he still has to check under his bed for Soviets, but his goal as of now seems to be to destroy any remnants of left-wing governance in Latin America. By taking out Venezuela, Cuba is now at risk of a crisis. The two countries have had somewhat of a symbiotic relationship. They collaborate in terms of trade, security, investment, and more. Venezuela sends oil to Cuba in return for Cuban doctors, military advisors, teachers, and the like. In fact, back when Cuba's main lifeline, the Soviet Union, dissolved in the early 90s and Cuba entered into an economic crisis known as the Special Period, it was Chávez's Venezuela that eventually came to help once Hugo assumed the presidency. So it's not exactly far-fetched to assume that Rubio may also be gunning for Cuba, using regime change in Venezuela as a pathway to fulfill his childhood fantasy of ending the Communist Party of Cuba. Anyway, that's all I have for this video. If you liked it, then head over to the No Politic Here podcast, where Chris and I touch on the topic some more in the latest episode. Thanks to my patrons over on Patreon for allowing me to make these high-quality productions, and a special written thanks to my top-tier patrons.